Hello and welcome to the Al Monitor Brief. It's Tuesday, August 13th. I'm Kristen Tolman. Today's main segment is a conversation with UNRWA's Communications Director, Juliette Touma, on how the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees has dealt with the war since October 7th, including allegations against staff members with involvement in Hamas's October 7th attack on southern Israel. But first, let's get you caught up on what's happening in the Middle East. Iran on Tuesday rejected Western calls to stand down its threat to retaliate against Israel for the killing of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran late last month. U.S. credit rating agency Fitch downgraded Israel a notch on Monday, warning that its ongoing conflict against Hamas in Gaza could last well into 2025 and weigh on economic activity. The U.S. says Iran's attack on Israel could be this week, and Iran's political scene was shell-shocked late on Sunday after prominent reformist figure Mohammad Zarif stepped down from his post as vice president only days after taking up the position. Now, on to the main segment. Juliette, welcome to the Al Monitor Brief.
Thanks for having me.
So, Juliette, catch us up to speed on what is the latest with UNRWA. What's the work you're doing in Gaza and other Palestinian territories, and also with Palestinians in countries all across the region?
Yes, so UNRWA, since the war began in Gaza on the 7th of October, has shifted gears. While before the war, our largest program was in education. We educated 300,000 boys and girls in about 200 schools across the Gaza Strip. We had to put our humanitarian and emergency hat on and focus on life-saving assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. So one of the first things that we've done just as the war began is we've opened our shelters, and people started coming into those shelters to seek refuge and seek protection. And at some point during the war, there was about 1 million people who were living in 150 UNRWA shelters. Our shelters were just overcrowded, overpopulated. People kept flocking to our facilities because of their hope, rightly so, that the United Nations flag will provide them with the protection. But I'm sure we'll cover this a little bit later because protection was not always there.
Yeah, that was then my follow-up question. First, how many people did these facilities, how many people are they typically able to hold? And did they provide protection for people and civilians looking for it?
You see, in the context of Gaza, because of the circumstances that Gaza has always been going through, and because of ongoing and reoccurring conflicts and wars over the past few years, we had planned at UNRWA for a worst-case scenario. And guess what? We planned for 50 of our facilities. We ended up using 150 of our facilities, and we've planned for a maximum of 150,000 people. That was the worst case scenario. We never expected that at some point we'll have 90% of Gaza basically seeking refuge in our shelters. And what this means is a huge responsibility, because people came to these UN buildings hoping that they will be safe, except nowhere is safe in Gaza. We've said it from early on. Two of our schools on the very first week of the conflict, they were hit with people sheltering in them killed or injured. Our headquarters in Gaza City was hit on the first week of the war. And those hits kept happening. I mean, only a couple of weeks ago, we had several of our schools, in fact, hit. Where we are right now is two-thirds of our facilities, our buildings in Gaza, two-thirds of them have been hit. And as a result, more than 570 people who were sheltering in our buildings were killed, and more than 1,700 people were injured. And the sad story to all of this is that every time a school or a building is hit is beyond the brick and mortar, because we can always reconstruct. Sad reality is that there are women and children and older people and regular men who have nothing to do with this war who get killed and injured.
Yeah. And something that is always critical to ask about UNRWA is that there's been, previously there's been a lot of educational training, and now you turn to a humanitarian response, crisis response. How is the ability to also turn back and give children education? Has that been a focus as we now stretch into 10 months into the war?
Look, education is the bread and butter of UNRWA, of this agency, not only in Gaza, but across the board. This is the only United Nations agency that runs schools. We run United Nations schools. Until the war, we ran more than 700 schools. We provided education for more than 500,000 boys and girls from grade 1 to grade 9. Then we provided what we call vocational training in training centers to help young people find jobs and get into the labor market. I'm not sure that that there's justice that was done to the education that this agency has provided to generations of Palestinians over the years. And I think the best testament to that is only successful people, whether still in the region or who have left the region. We have the great story from a NASA engineer who went to UNRWA schools. We have doctors, academics, people in the private sector, ambassadors. We have sports people. They all went to UNRWA schools. And the beauty about UNRWA schools, which is very unique, is that it's the only school system in the region that has a human rights program in it. So we teach the kids who come to our schools the United Nations values, the human rights, the peace, the tolerance, and that is something that is absolutely fundamental. And the question is right now, how can this agency, UNRWA, how can it be supported to continue to give education to children? Now, to your question, I know it's a very long answer, but to your question on specifically on Gaza. Children in Gaza have lost 1 year of their education as a result of the war. All schools, private, public, and UNRWA schools were all closed when the war started. And many of those buildings have become people's homes because people fled at such a volume. But what it meant for a child in Gaza is that they've lost 1 whole year of their education. And we know from previous conflicts in Gaza, but also around the world, that the longer a child stays out of school, the more difficult it is to catch up, and the higher the risk it becomes for those children to fall prey to exploitation. That includes child marriage, it includes child labor, it also includes recruitment into armed groups. So what we've done just in the past couple of weeks is we've launched the first phase of our Back to Learning program. And we're focusing right now on mental health and psychosocial activities for children as a first phase to contribute to children simply being children again. So it's a lot of gaming and play and some sports and some music and some artwork for children to do something different than just to be traumatized and shocked, because I cannot emphasize the level and the depth of the trauma among every single child in Gaza.
Certainly, certainly. And Juliette, earlier this spring, UNRWA faced allegations by these Israeli government, and then it was leaked in U.S. media of UNRWA employees' involvement in October 7th. What was the investigation that was found, and how did UNRWA look into that?
Okay, so what happened is the following. Back in January, the government of Israel has approached UNRWA Commissioner General and gave him allegations that were very, very serious to the agency. And those allegations had to do with 12 of UNRWA staff who were working with the agency in Gaza. The Israeli government has alleged that they have taken part in the horrific 7th of October attack on southern Israel. The Commissioner General has acted very swiftly. Within 1 week, he took the decision to terminate the contracts of these staff members. Together with the Secretary General of the United Nations, he started immediately an investigation. I'll tell you about the outcomes in a minute. And he also launched a review that looked at risk management in the agency, and it looked specifically at how much the agency, meaning UNRWA, abides in its programs and among its staff abides by the neutrality humanitarian principle. So all that was done within 1 week after us receiving the allegations. Now, the Office of Internal Oversight and Investigations, OIOS, which is the highest investigative body in the United Nations. They started this investigation. They completed it last week. And according to the investigation, out of the group of the staff in question, there were 9 staff members who might be involved in the attack of 7 October if the evidence was authenticated or corroborated. Right, so it's important that we add this caveat and to be very accurate. Despite that, the Commissioner General decided that he would terminate the contracts of these staff members, and he did that in what we call in the best interest of the agency to protect the agency's work. And the agency's work is about the work that we do for the communities that we serve, and to ensure that there won't be any interruption in the work that the agency does across the region and in Gaza, as we serve one of the most vulnerable communities in the world, and these are Palestinian refugees.
Okay, and just to follow up, so the 9 out of 12 being can you just clarify that caveat right there? It's that was the UN investigative body not able to compare the evidence given by the Israeli? Can you clarify that caveat?
Look, I wish I can, but I can't, because as UNRWA, we are not authorized to comment on the proceedings of the investigations, and I'm not privy to the information that the investigation received. All I can say is what I covered in the first answer. We have across the region 30,000 people working with us, so it's always good to put things in proportion. If we're talking about 9 staff, this is 0.03% of a total number of staff. The review that I mentioned to you, that the independent review that was done and headed by a former Foreign Minister of France, Catherine Colonna, with a number of well-known organizations, that review said that in fact UNRWA has the highest scrutiny systems in its procedures, and that it, in comparison to other UN agencies of the size and volume or non-governmental organizations, that it actually adheres most to the principle of neutrality. And this is something that we have over the years worked very, very closely on with our teams on the ground. And the essence of this agency is that it is one of the largest human development agencies. It provides education, education, it provides primary health care to this group of people in the region that no other body provides assistance to. And in times of emergencies, over and over again, we have stepped up, and our humanitarian frontline workers were there to save lives of Palestinians.
Yeah. And it seems like other countries who provided funding to UNRWA have reinstated that. How is the funding for UNRWA now? I mean, back in the spring, once when the allegations came out and countries pulled funding, it looked like a real dire moment to provide all these services that you just mentioned. How does funding stand now?
You're absolutely right. If you ask me this question in January, when the story first broke, it was very, very grim, because what happened is that within 48 hours of, by the way, the information did not leak on the allegations. We at UNRWA, through the Commissioner General of the agency, we put out a statement. We acknowledged what happened. We said what are the measures that are going to be put forward, and that was a very responsible act on behalf of UNRWA by the UNRWA Commissioner General, at the price of, within 48 hours, 16 countries, including the largest donors of the agency. The price was very heavy. There was a suspension of the funding. So if you asked me the question back in January, I would have said that the agency, and I have said that the agency was on its deathbed, and that we needed a breath of life and a push for this agency to survive. Now, thankfully, a lot has happened since. Most of the donors, in fact, 15 out of the 16 countries that have suspended the funding, they've all returned, and they are all funding the agency again. And that's absolutely fantastic and very welcome, because that meant that there was no interruptions, not even for one day, in the services and the humanitarian work that we do across the region, including in Gaza, that we were able to continue to pay the running cost of the agency, and we continue to be able to pay the salaries for our frontline workers, including the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, and also the humanitarians in places like Gaza, Syria, Lebanon. So there was no interruption. Where we stand right now is almost where we were every year in September, because this is a UN agency that operates through a hand-to-mouth approach. So it relies heavily on donations, mainly from the member states. And so we have visibility on our financial situation until end of September. And we should know soon how are we going to handle things after end of September. What's very, very interesting is that amid the suspension that we had with the member states, we had huge support from the private sector, individuals, foundations, people who have come forward to give assistance, financial assistance, donations to UNRWA. And here, I mean, also for your audiences, every single penny that we got counted, and every single penny helped us to continue, and helped us to continue to provide assistance to people in need, including those in Gaza. And then some other member states who have been donating to UNRWA have either increased or stepped up their assistance. And we've also seen new countries coming forward to help us, including from the region, for example, Algeria, Iraq, and there were others from the region and around the world.
Juliette, there's questions around, I mean, you said it was funding until the end of September, but what does the future of UNRWA look like now, especially so as more Palestinian refugees are displaced and are now in more corners of the world, including in Australia, more in Qatar, et cetera. How does UNRWA see its future, hopefully in some day after of the Israel-Gaza war?
Look, I wish I had a crystal ball, and I think in this war we all learned that prediction is is a fool man's game, right? So it's very hard to predict. What I do know is that the agency has a mandate to operate only in the Gaza Strip, in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. We don't have a mandate to serve Palestinian refugees anywhere else. And that's a mandate, by the way, that's been given to us as an agency by the United Nations General Assembly. So any change in the mandate or any proposal to change the mandate has got to go back to the United Nations General Assembly. What I also know is that there is no alternative to UNRWA, and that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian operation in Gaza. It's the backbone of providing education to Palestinian refugees in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the West Bank. And that's it's impossible to replace UNRWA unless there is a political solution that provides an answer to the plight of Palestine refugees. And until then, there's no alternative to UNRWA.
Juliette, thank you so much for coming on the Al Monitor Brief and catching us up to the minute on UNRWA's work in the region.
Thank you for having me, Kristen.
That's it for today, Tuesday, August 13th. You can read all these stories and more impacting the region at allmonitor.com.